Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Doug Johnson. I am the MassDOT project manager for the Silverline Extension Alternatives Analysis. Um, we are just going to wait one more minute or so before we start this meeting to let a few more members of the stakeholder working group arrive, and then we'll get started. If you are a member of the public watching this, thank you very much for joining us. It will just be a moment or so before we get started. So thank you very much for bearing with us. All right, I think we are going to get started. And I'm sure some other folks um, will join us mid-meeting, which is totally fine. But in the interest of time, since we have so much to cover today, I think we will go ahead and get started and folks can join us while we're underway. So once again, thank you all very much for joining us. As I mentioned, my name is Doug Johnson. I'm the MassDOT project manager for the Silverline Extension Alternatives Analysis. This is the third working group meeting for this study. I'm going to turn it over to Reagan Checchio from our project team to talk about the Zoom controls and how to participate in this meeting. Reagan?
Thanks, Doug. Teresa, thanks, great. So for working group participants, I would like to remind you all the rules for participating in the meeting and remind everyone that the meeting is being recorded. Please remain muted when you are not speaking to prevent excessive background noise. If you have questions during the presentation or would like to share comments during the discussion, please press the raise hand button. When we recognize you, you may unmute yourself to share your question or comment. You will also notice that there is a Q&A feature, but we would ask you not to use the Q&A feature for your comments because we hope to hear the working group feedback verbally, and we want to use Q&A for public comments and questions. You will also notice that the chat feature of Zoom is enabled. Only working group members and project staff are able to use this feature, but we would ask that you select, well, it says on the screen to select panelists and attendees, but Zoom has changed its look. So instead of panelists and attendees, please use the drop down to have it sent to everyone. So our attendees as well as panelists can see those comments. That's going to be during the alignment discussion we're going to have later on in the meeting. And for members of the public, we just want to let you know that based on the fullness of today's agenda, it is unlikely we're going to have a public comment section at the end of the meeting, though of course, if time permits, we will. But we would encourage you to use the question and answer feature to type in any comments you might have. While we may not be able to read them all verbally or respond to them during the meeting, we will definitely be taking that feedback in. And I will also just let you know that while the key question and answers are visible to working group members, they won't be visible though to other attendees. So I think that is all for the rules of the road, as it were. So I'll turn it back over to you, Doug.
Thank you, Reagan. I'll now take a moment to ask members of the stakeholder working group to please type their name and affiliation into the chat box, if you don't mind. This is for our own record keeping. It's also so that other folks on this call can see who is here and who they represent. So as Reagan mentioned, please make sure you select the appropriate checkbox in the drop-down list. And if you can put in your name and title, or excuse me, name and affiliation, we would greatly appreciate it. I'll just give folks a second to do that. On the slide here, you see an agenda and our meeting purpose. We do have a lot to discuss today, but we are going to keep this meeting within the time limit that we set. We won't run over. The purpose of today's meeting is to review the findings from our Tier 1 analysis and discuss some potential alternatives moving into the next phase, the Tier 2 alternatives. Excuse me, Tier 2 analysis. We'll start with an update since our last meeting, go through the findings of the Tier 1 analysis, then have a discussion amongst our group about those findings. Then we'll talk about the Tier 2 alternatives that we've drafted, have a discussion about those, and then talk about next steps and upcoming outreach. Before we go to the next slide, I want to note that we have drafted some alternatives for discussion today, but they are by no means finalized. There's still a lot of work to do in developing alternatives before we get deeper into the next phase of our analysis. So we're going to show you a list of alternatives and a corresponding map, but they are by no means final. They are certainly open to discussion and feedback. And of course, we are still developing them and refining them. There are still many questions that we need to answer before we move forward in this analysis. But we wanted to have this meeting with you all to discuss these with you before we get deeper into that process. We thought it was really important that we sort of pause here for a second at this phase and get everyone's feedback before moving forward. So when we show you this map on the next slide, please don't think that we've completed that phase of the process or anything. This is still very much in development. We can go to the next slide. So this slide shows 5 draft alternatives that we've put together that we could potentially advance into that Tier 2 analysis. I'm just going to read the list really quick and show you how to read the map essentially. So all 5 alternatives start at the existing terminal of the SL3 in Chelsea and go to a new terminal on this map. So the first is the Chelsea terminal to Wellington. The second is the Chelsea terminal to Sullivan. The third is to Kendall Square by way of Sullivan. The fourth is to Haymarket by way of Sullivan. And the fifth is to Kendall, actually by way of Wellington and Route 28. I should also note on this map, you see a dashed black line going up Broadway in Everett to north of Glendale Square. In developing the early drafts of our alternatives, we recognized that not every alternative needs to be an extension of the SL3. Some of these alternatives may make sense to have as an extension of the SL3, whereas other alternatives may make more sense to have as a separate service. And in fact, the Lower Mystic Regional Working Group report recommended 2 services. So in recognizing that, we wanted to reflect the fact that in developing these, it may make sense to actually have different origin points for some of these alternatives. Maybe they shouldn't all start at the terminal of the SL3. The Lower Mystic Regional Working Group report recommended a service coming north and south on Broadway from north of Glendale Square. So we've included that in here as well. And in our discussions with the bus network redesign team, we've been talking to them about travel demand between Malden and Chelsea and the potential need to serve that demand. So it's also possible that we could have a terminal that connects to, or excuse me, an alternative that connects to a terminal at Malden Center. So this is something that's still very much in development. We're still working out as we come up with the service plans for all these alternatives and figure out what actually makes sense for each in terms of origin point and final terminal location. But we wanted to lead the meeting with a preview of those. We're going to discuss each one of these in the second half of the presentation, but I wanted to sort of lead with the headline and put these out there to you. Many of you have seen these already in meetings that we've had with you, but I wanted to lead with that so that you could see these. And then we'll talk through our Tier 1 analysis and then get into these potential alternatives in Tier 2. Next slide. So I just want to remind folks of the purpose of this study. The purpose of this analysis is to assess the feasibility, utility, and cost of various alignment and service frequency options of an extension of the Silver Line, providing high-quality transit from Chelsea through Everett and on to Somerville, Cambridge, and/or Boston. To that point about Somerville, Cambridge, and/or Boston, we recognize that if we are evaluating options that, a terminal location at Malden Center, for instance, it may make sense to evaluate that service extension paired with another that goes down Broadway to Sullivan or other destinations. So as we develop those alternatives, we're going to be looking at different types of services and potentially different combinations of services and see how those interact with each other. Next slide. The need that we identified for this study, you're all familiar with this, but I will read it out loud for folks who are seeing this for the first time. The project's overarching objective is to add transit service capacity and connectivity that will knit together Chelsea and Everett with nearby communities that are not currently well connected with high quality transit. Existing transit service is not very competitive with driving for many types of trips being made to and from Chelsea and Everett. But despite that lack of competitiveness, bus ridership in Chelsea and Everett during the pandemic has been more durable than in other communities. The bus routes that serve Chelsea and Everett have had some of the highest ridership in the system over the last year and a half. Chelsea, Everett, Somerville, and Cambridge are experiencing rapid growth in housing and employment in areas that are not currently well served by transit. So part of this study is looking at where the growth in population and housing will be and how we could potentially serve those growth areas with transit service. And then there are existing transit connections in Chelsea and Everett and nearby communities that could potentially be leveraged or improved into a more high quality cohesive network. So this is sort of getting at the coordination that we're doing with the bus network redesign process, which is looking at redesigning the entire bus network. And we recognize that any of our alternatives may overlap with the new bus network once it has been fully developed. And we need to understand through our process how those alternatives will interact with the changes to the bus network. Next slide. To that point, we are coordinating with those other efforts, as well as a few others that are underway, including the Wellington Circle study and the McGrath Boulevard project. But I wanted to pause here for a second and make a quick note about the difference between bus network redesign and the Silver Line extension, and why these processes are sort of going hand in hand with each other, but are slightly different from each other. So bus network redesign is looking at existing travel demand within the entire MBTA bus service area with the goal of beginning to redesign service over the next 3 years, starting with a phased implementation in the fall of 2022. So next year. BNERD, the abbreviation for bus network redesign, is specifically focused on identifying newer underserved areas that merit better transit, given that the region has changed so drastically in recent years, but the bus network has not kept up with that pace of change. On the other hand, the Silver Line Extension study focuses on a smaller geographic area and a longer range planning horizon. Our future conditions are based on 2040 projections for population and jobs. And the purpose of our study is to provide a more rapid transit-like service from the Chelsea and Everett areas to neighboring communities. So while conditions are going to vary depending on the alignments that we look at, we are assuming that the implementation of a Silver Line extension is going to be more capital intensive than bus network redesign. And the implementation of our preferred alternative that we select through this process could take longer than that first phase of BNERD implementation, depending on the characteristics of the alternative and the availability of funding. So there is considerable overlap of alignments between the Silver Line study and bus network redesign, but the studies may ultimately advance different alignments due to the differences between the purposes of the studies, the timelines, and the focuses of each study. The absence of any alignments from one study does not mean that those alignments are not appropriate for the other study. The presence or absence of an alignment in one study or another is just a reflection of the studies using slightly different evaluation criteria due to their different purposes and focuses. So when we show you those alternatives again later in this process, you may say, hey, I've seen the bus network redesign high frequency corridor map, which is currently under development. The routes look slightly different. Why is that? Or why have the results of this study not perfectly lined up with the results of bus network redesign? But it's because we have slightly different purposes, focuses, and our evaluation criteria is slightly different due to the different purposes of these studies. I just wanted to put that out there for the folks who were wondering about that because of how much overlap there is between these two studies. Next slide. This is our study area. Again, you've all seen this. It was developed to encompass the likely study alignments that would meet our purpose and need with a reasonable buffer to reflect some uncertainty. So there is a little bit of fluidity in this, as I mentioned earlier, but for the most part, this is the study area that we've been looking at. Next slide. Here's our project schedule. This has been updated since the last time you saw this. You can see this vertical pink line that says we are here that reflects where we are in this process. That orange star is this stakeholder working group meeting. Right now, we are developing our tier 2 alternatives. As I mentioned, the goal is to finalize those by the end of September, beginning of October, and then take the next couple months after that to complete the analysis of those alternatives. The goal is to have the alternatives analysis complete by the end of this calendar year or beginning of next calendar year. And then we plan to have another stakeholder working group meeting sometime in winter 2022, followed by a third public meeting, and ideally the selection of a preferred alternative. I will say between now and the end of December, we are going to meet with all of our municipal stakeholders several times. We've been meeting with many of you over the past couple months since our last stakeholder working group meeting, and those conversations will continue as we move forward. In fact, we're actually meeting with some of you in the next couple weeks before that public meeting on the 28th. So there's going to be many individual meetings that we need to have with municipalities as we refine and work out the details of these alternatives. We'll talk a little bit more about what we actually need to figure out in order to advance this analysis later on in the presentation. Next slide. But quick update since the last time we all met as a group in April. Next slide. Since we all last met, we held our first public meeting. We had an online feedback form, which received around 100 responses in April and May. That feedback form solicited input on our goals and objectives. We then updated our goals and objectives based on the feedback that we got and from the conversations that we had with both internal and external stakeholders. We evaluated our tier 1 concepts, finalized the tier 1 analysis, and started aligning the study for beginning the tier 2 analysis, which is what we've been doing in the last 2 months or so. Next slide. I'm now going to turn it over to Teresa Carr from the project team, who's going to talk about the results of the tier 1 analysis and then help facilitate a discussion at the end. Teresa?
Thanks, Doug. And just to clarify, do you want to go through the goals and objectives, or would you like me to do that?
Great question. Thank you. I transitioned to you too early. I will go through that. Thank you. Just to remind folks of the evaluation process that we developed for this study, we started off with reviewing all of the ideas that had been presented in prior studies, including the Everett Transit Action Plan and the Lower Mystic Regional Working Group report. We then screened those ideas against our project purpose and need to see if they met those. The ones that did, we then advanced into the tier 1 evaluation, which we have essentially completed at this point. So that tier 1 evaluation looked at individual alignments and evaluated them against our goals and objectives. We developed actual measurable metrics for each one of our objectives and scored the alignments on those metrics. So we will show the results of that to you in the next few slides. But we looked at all of the alignments, took the ones that scored the best on our metrics and put them together into those longer routes that we showed earlier on in the presentation. So this is where we're at right now, sort of in between that analysis of the individual alignments and actually packaging together full alternatives that will advance into the tier 2 analysis. Next slide. You've seen this before. This just lays out our objectives under different goal areas that we patch them to, and then the metrics that we use to evaluate these objectives. If anyone wants to get into the weeds on these and actually understand what our methodology was for measuring any of these objectives, we are happy to schedule a meeting with you to do so. We have a memo that explains our whole methodology and all of our results. It's too much information to share in a meeting this long, but we're happy to sit down with any of you and share all of that and talk about our methodology if you're interested. But one thing I did want to note on this next slide is that one thing we realized was lacking in our evaluation was a way to assess the actual implementability, if that's a word, of any of these alignments. So we needed to look at the right-of-way widths and the conditions on the ground of any of our alternatives and see what we actually thought would be feasible to fit into those right-of-ways, or what the impacts would be if we needed to widen right-of-ways on any of those alignments. So we added this goal area called Advancing Feasible and Implementable Solutions. And these objectives are all based on the ability to actually build any of these alternatives. So we'll talk about how our alignments scored on that as well. But that's something that's new since our last stakeholder working group meeting. So we wanted to share that with all of you. And then I think Teresa, this is just a reminder of how we broke up our study area, because it is sort of a large study area. We needed to break it up into sections because we recognized that within different segments of our study area, there were many different ways that you could make some of these connections. So from the terminal of the SL3 in Chelsea to Everett Square, for instance, that's gonna be the first one we go through. There were several different ways that you can make that connection. We needed to evaluate all of those alignments against each other to see which one would perform best and then advance that into tier 2. So we broke up the study area into these 4 sections that you see here. Chelsea to Everett, Everett to the Orange Line, and that's sort of where Malden Center comes back into play. And then from the Orange Line to Kendall, or Orange Line to Boston, depending on where you've connected to the Orange Line. But Teresa is going to go through the results of that tier 1 analysis from here.
Great, thanks, Doug. So first of all, we will go section by section. So we just showed our basic study area broken up by the 4 sections as Doug went through with you. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes walking through what we looked at on a section by section basis, how each concept performed in relation to our goals and objectives, and then what we are recommending moves forward into the tier 2 process. So it is a lot of information. We've built in several minutes for discussion at the end of this part of the presentation. So first, starting with section 1, which starts at Chelsea Station and largely ends at Sweetser Circle with one exception. We explored 7 different concepts. Many of these explore the commuter rail right of way. We have some that are routing onto Route 16, others along 2nd Street to serve Everett Square, and one concept, as Doug referenced earlier, that originates at Glendale Square and operates along Upper Broadway. So the main findings of the tier 1 show that our concepts all performed pretty well in relation to our goals and objectives. Now, the legend here is really meant to indicate that green is good. And one thing that's important to note is that these scales are simply to have the conversation about trade-offs. Most of these concepts perform really well in relation to mobility and access, in relation to equity, in relation to climate resiliency. Now, concept 1D stands out in how it operates on street to the extent possible. So gets a lot of visibility for that reason. You're on street as opposed to the commuter rail, which is kind of in back of some of the land uses that we're hoping to attract ridership from. But also that it serves Everett Square. Now, that was something that we really found as being important from this tier 1 analysis, is that serving Everett Square is a really important thing to do. So concept 1B is also interesting to us. It follows largely the same alignment as concept 1D, except that it doesn't rely on the commuter rail right of way, apart from crossing it. And so for that reason, we recommend moving both of these concepts into the next stage of evaluation. Now, we looked pretty closely at concept 1G. From a service perspective, there's a lot to like about this concept. You note that it scores not as well as concepts 1B and 1D in relation to mobility and access. And this is really because the land uses in direct vicinity of this concept are of lower density. We have neighborhood retail, we have residential. That explains that lower score, but we do want to keep this alignment on the table as we think about how we would structure a service, especially in light of the coordination with bus network redesign and what Doug referenced about, the fact that this service might not originate at Glendale Square, but might extend a little bit farther north. So this is what we recommend moving forward into the tier 2 analysis. Because 1D's alignment provides the most value in serving Everett Square, we did modify 1B a little bit so that it replicates everything that we like about 1D. And the only difference between these two concepts is that 1B would not rely on that commuter rail right of way. So also, as I mentioned, looking at a service alternative that would operate on Upper Broadway. And this alignment would require some more coordination with bus network redesign in relation to service. So moving on to section 2. In section 2, we explored 3 concepts. 2 that serve Lower Broadway and go over the Alfred Street Bridge to Sullivan, and 1 that uses Route 16 to Wellington. Now, the difference between these 2 concepts, 2A and 2B, is that 2A operates in street, 2B operates in the commuter rail right of way and back of the casino. The findings from the tier 1 evaluation in section 2 is that 2A performs great. There's a lot to like about this concept, acknowledging that the right-of-way along Lower Broadway can be constrained in parts. It does have a poor score, 2A and 2B, both have a poor score for climate resiliency. This is due to the fact that both 2A and 2B go over the Alfred Street Bridge. And we looked at potential for impacts related to flooding from climate change. 2B uses the commuter rail right of way, which offers lower visibility, as I mentioned in section 1. It also introduced some implementation complications that we can avoid by staying on Lower Broadway. Now, 2C doesn't perform as well as 2A. That's the one that connects to Wellington in several key goal areas. But one where it does is climate resiliency. It's due to avoiding Alfred Street Bridge. At this point, we're thinking that we could want to explore this connection to Wellington in more detail. So we are recommending that we move that forward into the tier 2 analysis. So here you go. We are recommending 2A, focusing on this alignment, Lower Broadway over the Alfred Street Bridge and into Sullivan. And then 2C, which would, one thing to note about 2C is that different from the last time we showed you this map where we were routing 2C along Route 16, we are looking at routing it along the Santilli connector instead. That would be between Sweetser Circle and Santilli Circle. This is really, we think that we could see some travel time advantages there of just avoiding some of the congestion that you see around Route 16. We have some lesser congested conditions on the connector. So moving into section 3. Section 3, we looked at a bunch of concepts. So the main corridors were Interbelt Road, Fells Way, McGrath, along Washington to McGrath, along Rutherford Avenue over the Gilmore Bridge, all using some variation of First Street or Land Boulevard to Binney into Kendall. Now, the alignment from the Lower Mystic Working Group study is shown here as 3A, and Doug will talk about our findings on that alignment now.
Thanks, Teresa. Our consultant team looked at the bridge that had been proposed back in 2013 or earlier for Interbelt Road, from Interbelt Road into North Point in Cambridge. And they found that that bridge had a conflict with the yard lead ramp from the Green Line extension. So you can see that here on this map, this little red highlighted spur in the call out window here is a spur that exists to accommodate the potential for a future connection from this part of the Green Line extension tracks into the Green Line maintenance facility. So the bridge that had been previously proposed is actually at the same vertical elevation as that ramp and a potential future extension of that ramp. Right now, what you see there is existing. You can see that there's a small conflict, but the bridge that had been previously proposed, if it were to be built at that elevation, would preclude the possibility of that future connection into the Green Line maintenance facility. So our project team looked at what it would take to elevate that bridge so as not to preclude that connection in the future. So our structural engineering subconsultants took a look at this, created a model of this bridge, and they found that you could build this bridge high enough to clear that ramp and not have a conflict with the existing spur or a future ramp. However, by raising that bridge that high, you have to make the structure longer. You kick out the approaches, namely to the north along Interbelt Road. So with the bridge that had been previously proposed, there were going to be some impacts on Interbelt Road to the right-of-way and the businesses along that stretch. But with this bridge, those conflicts would be extended further up Interbelt Road past 3rd Ave. So technically, while you technically would be able to overcome these issues due to the anticipated effort needed to do so, as well as the other anticipated impacts associated with building the bridge, plus the presence of a less impactful alternative route, namely Washington Street to McGrath, the team has decided not to move this alignment forward for further consideration in this study. If folks are curious about our findings about this, if they want to talk about this specifically, we're happy to schedule a meeting with you separately to meet with our project team to talk about it. We can show you the model that they created and talk about the findings, but because of the potential conflicts and effort that we believe it would take to overcome those conflicts and those issues, we've decided not to advance this into tier 2. Back to you, Teresa.
So this is showing the evaluation results in section 3. And what we saw was that nothing here is perfect, but some concepts perform better than others. So Doug already talked through some of the challenges with Interbelt Road, concept 3A. Concept 3C, which operates along Washington to McGrath, we feel shows a lot of promise. Operating between Wellington to Kendall along Route 28 is something we'd like to explore a little bit more. We also, we've had a couple of conversations with the city of Cambridge. We just in the technical team have some uncertainty about what right of way we can assume is available for transit priority. So we are keeping both an alignment that would go down First Street and an alignment that would go down Land Boulevard on the table for a little while longer. Concepts 3C and 3F from the west. So here are these two that we would be moving into tier 2. They share the same alignment between Sullivan and Leechmere. And so the only difference there is the circulation between Leechmere and Kendall. And similarly, between 3B and 3C, they share an alignment south of where Washington Street meets McGrath. So the difference between these two is really Route 28 north of Washington Street. So the tier 2, we're really going to be exploring the impacts, the benefits of those differences. So concepts utilizing the Gilmore Bridge, we did find miss and critical populations that are served by other concepts. Didn't perform poorly, but it didn't perform as well as the others. Now, Bus network redesign has shown some promise for a similar line, so we will continue conversations with them. Moving into section 4. Oh, so this is what we're looking at. So moving into section 4, we looked at 4 concepts here. 2, which is 4A and 4B, connect with North Station, and another 2, which is 4C and 4D, connect with Haymarket. The starting points is really just the difference between starting at Sullivan or starting at Lechmere. None of these concepts did very well in relation to climate resiliency, but there are broader efforts underway, Climate Ready Boston, Climate Ready Charlestown, that focus on these larger needs. And we will be exploring more how our alignments can fit within these larger strategies in the Tier 2. Concept 4C stands out in how it performs related to mobility and access, has the potential to connect and serve more people by operating along Rutherford between Sullivan and Washington. And in terms of implementation, by continuing to Haymarket along Washington instead of trying to navigate along Causeway to North Station. So furthermore, we're interested in this concept's potential to connect with possible future BRT service in downtown that would connect between North Station and South Boston waterfront. So this section is unique in how we're recommending just one concept move forward, but it also started with some simpler questions. Do you start from Lechmere, from Sullivan? Do you end at North Station or Haymarket? In the next part of our presentation, I think you'll see that there are still many, many circulation options that exist within this main concept within downtown. So this graphic shows where we go from here, which is to go from a long list of potential concepts, which is where we started, to a reasonable range of alternatives to carry into a more robust analysis. And here we'd really like to start having a discussion. We have a few minutes set aside for discussion. These findings are still draft. Doug mentioned we are preparing some documentation about methodology, data, findings, and we'd be happy to sit down with anyone that's interested and go over it in some more detail. But we'd love to take a couple minutes, go through with you what we've done so far. Do you think this process missed anything? Are you surprised by your findings? Is there anything that you think we should have looked at differently? And let's start with Jay.
Thanks, Teresa. So I have 3 or 4 questions, but I'll start with the most general one, which has to do with the scoring system. And I apologize, I did step out for a minute when you started, so you may have covered this already. But I'm trying to understand, how are we weighting these different categories, climate resiliency, mobility, access, safety, and so on. And I guess I'd like to see a little more about more detail about why a certain alignment scored poorly on one versus another. So if we said it, didn't score well for climate resiliency, why was that? And I mean, how do we recognize if it scores poorly in one area, but the solution to that makes the project score poorly in another? And it starts to get very complicated.
So
okay, you have it here. Yep. Okay, so you have this here. I can look at this in a little bit, but I just hope that we can also weight these things, because I think at the end of the day, for Everett especially, and I would say the same probably for Chelsea and Malden, but we're doing this with the goal of expanding mobility and access in an equitable manner. Like for us, those are the 2 primary goals. So, recognizing that getting from here to there, travels through geographic areas that have, are not climate resilient just by their nature, right? I don't know that in my mind justifies maybe not serving an area the same way if it doesn't serve the people that we need to serve and the places we need to serve. So as we go forward with this, I just want to make sure that we're not overweighting one over another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate the question. So let me just explain what we did. Each one of these goal areas has a finding, right? That's the colored squares that I showed for each concept in each section. And that's basically, so we have these metrics. So looking at mobility and access as an example, you see 5 metrics. We had 5 different scorings for each concept in relation to that goal area of expand mobility and access. What we did then is we kind of aggregated the information up, took a look at it and said, overall, in relation to mobility and access, this concept performs very well, very poorly, somewhere in between. And that was looking at how it scored in relation to all those different metrics. Now, we considered whether we did a more official weighting process. We wanted to make sure, and this is something that I had at the beginning of the presentation, so you might have been something that you missed, is we aren't adding up like the number of green squares and calling a concept a recommendation. Instead, we want to be able to show the trade-offs. And in fact, you can see some concepts that we're recommending move forward into the tier 2 evaluation perform poorly in relation to some of our goal areas. And I agree with you. It's very possible that we're able to mitigate that through the planning, through the design process. Safety is one, right? We want to not, our safety measure, let me show you, for example, we're looking at where we're having known safety issues, right? So we want to make sure that we are not penalizing any concept that goes through an area where we have a known safety issue, because we should be able to present a design that would mitigate that known safety issue. We just want to make sure that we're avoiding something that isn't going to be possible to solve or address.
So when you say a safety issue, you're referring to like a high crash location or something like that? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right. So that was my first question. Thank you. The next question was in relation to the commuter rail corridor options. I sort of got the sense that there was this desire to not depend on the commuter rail, and as if that was an advantage somehow. I wanted to clarify that and understand, is that the case?
Yeah, no, what we found is actually 1D. So commuter rail shows up in sections 1 and section 2. Okay. And so in section 1D, we actually saw showing the most promise. And this does rely on a section of the commuter rail right of way between the current terminus and 2nd Street. We just wanted to give ourselves the option, if we move this process forward, we found something in conceptual design that would make it difficult, right? We know that this is a constrained area, that we also had the ability to look at a different alternative, right?
Right.
But no, I mean, you can look at 1B and 1D, they perform, similar, but we really liked a lot about 1D. And then that was a little bit different in section 2, just because of, as I mentioned, staying on street attracts a lot of visibility. It would be, we think, a lot of benefits from staying on street in this section. And we also had some implementation concerns just in how you bring the concept back onto Lower Broadway from the commuter rail right of way. So that actually had an effect on 2B's performance.
Yeah, and I see Suzanne made a comment, I think it speaks to this a little bit too, which is, when we say an implementable solution, does that mean technical feasibility? I think you get to this issue of, when something looks hard, do we avoid it? And I think the answer for us is no, we don't necessarily avoid it if it serves mobility and access and equity. I think that's an important point that I want to make on behalf of Everett, that just because it's difficult doesn't mean it's not worth it. And so I hope we're not looking at something like the commuter rail right of way in that section between 2nd and 3rd Street as well. It's hard, so we'll just not do it. I think that's, we need to take a harder look and say, is it what produces the better mobility and equity result?
Agreed. And I think when we get into the next part of the presentation, we will go through a couple of our design assumptions in that specific section as well.
Great.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in here, Teresa, could you go back to the slide that shows all of the alignments for section 1? So we found in our evaluation for these, I just want to clarify it because I think that the existence of 1B coming out of the tier 1 evaluation may give a false impression. 1B is there as we continue to evaluate the commuter rail right of way, just in case we run into sort of an obstacle or condition that precludes the extension of a busway along the commuter rail right of way. The alignment that goes along the commuter rail right of way and then up to Everett Square scored the best. And that you see that in the results of the tier 1 analysis. We're actively taking a look at the commuter rail right of way between the Chelsea Terminal and 2nd Street. 1B is sort of a backup in case we run into a condition where we say like, there is a physical limitation here that renders that idea not feasible. But the connection up to Everett Square from the Chelsea Terminal along the commuter rail right of way initially did score the best in our metrics. The continuing along the commuter rail right of way didn't score as well because you miss that population center in Everett. You don't get as many transfers to other services. You don't serve as many people if you don't route through Everett Square. So that's the reason why you see 1B in this and why 1C didn't score as well.
Great.
I
So,
have two more questions, but I'll let somebody else go and I'll come back later.
okay, that sounds good, because I do want to do a little bit of a time check, Doug. We probably want to be moving on to the second half of the presentation by 3, do you think, or maybe 3:05?
I think we can probably push it a little bit if folks have a lot of questions that we should get through. But let's go to Vineet next, and then Jay, we'll come back to your last 2
I
questions.
think Suzanne was actually
Sure.
second.
Oh, I apologize. Suzanne?
Thank you. A comment and 2 questions. So I think it's hard to understand how you got from the criteria to these decisions that are now like sort of just color squares. And I would ask for transparency in the way this analysis and these conclusions were drawn. It would be really great to see, and I think that speaks to some of the issues that Jay mentioned as well. The first question is, I thought I heard you say that it was still being debated whether to go all the way along Rutherford or through Leechmere, but at the same time, the only alternative that survived was the one that follows Rutherford. So I was confused about that. And then lastly, I'm wondering whether the analysis of climate resiliency that is being used in this process is the same that the MBTA uses for the MBTA system. I can't quote it exactly, but it's something to the effect of they don't intend to make the system climate change proof, but make sure that the system can easily recover if there's an event. So I'm just wondering if this is the same standard that's being applied in this context.
Mhm.
Thank
All
you.
right, I'll speak to your first point. We will share the documentation for our methodology for the tier 1 analysis, including how we combine the scores on individual metrics into a composite score that you saw in those colored boxes. We'll share that with everyone in the stakeholder working group, and then we're happy to set up meetings with other stakeholders to go through it once you've had a chance to look at it, if you're interested in discussing it or getting deeper into that analysis. We certainly want to make that available to everybody. And of course, that would obviously be included in a final report as well, but I know that folks want to engage with that and provide input on that at this point in the study. So we're happy to share that memo and then set up meetings with anyone who would like to discuss that. To the point about climate change resiliency, our main thought when we laid out these goals and objectives was, we know that some sections of our study area are vulnerable to flooding, especially in future year conditions. So we wanted a way to differentiate between alignments that would be more vulnerable to flooding from alignments that would be able to avoid that. However, what we found in our analysis is that in section 1, for instance, the difference is not really enough to be a determining factor, but perhaps more importantly, the flooding vulnerability in the commercial triangle in Everett can be addressed by a separate effort. There's a point where water would infiltrate that area. You can see it on this map just south of here, where it says Market Street. But there are other efforts that are looking at addressing that. Same thing with sections in Boston. The flooding issues that will exist in the future are being addressed by other planning efforts. So that ended up not being a determining factor in our selection of alignments. Many of our sections, scored poorly on climate resiliency because of that, but we decided not to have that become the deciding factor between these, knowing that those issues will be addressed by other efforts outside of this one. So I think, Jay, you had that question as well, like if that was going to be a determining factor or not, but I'll say it is not what made a difference in the selection of any of these alignments. And I know that is different than what you described, Suzanne, but we just created that criteria specific to this process as we try to figure out if any of these routes would be more susceptible to future flooding than others.
Well, and I will add that climate change resiliency is one of those goal areas where our tier 2 metrics are different from our tier 1 metrics. So we are able, with a smaller set of alternatives to drill down in a little bit more detail. So I think you'll see some consistency there with the MBTA process.
That's true. Thank you, Teresa. Yeah, I shouldn't say that the climate change metric is entirely about avoiding flooding. One of the things that we're doing in tier 2 is evaluating greenhouse gas emissions for any of these alternatives and potential mode shift due to the implementation of any of these alternatives. So that's a factor as well. But as Teresa said, we don't look at that until we get into tier 2. So that's not reflected in those scores that you saw.
And then I think the final question was related to the alignment along Rutherford. And I would say that, so Doug, I think just flashed up the tier 2 alternatives, the draft tier 2 alternatives. We do have one that's going to Kendall as a terminus, as well as one that is going to downtown Boston as an alternative. And the one into downtown Boston we're assuming along Rutherford Avenue.
Can you just switch to that slide real quick? Sorry, the tier 2.
Yeah, let me fast forward to it. We're going to show it again. We're going to be going through it in a lot more detail. Here we go. Well, here's one that shows it. So we have one going into downtown. Sorry, one into downtown, and well, I guess 2 going into Kendall. But I guess before we go into the tier 2 piece, can we go to Vineet? You're on mute.
It's like maybe your microphone isn't working. It's showing you're unmuted, but it's not showing a connection.
Maybe we could go over to Ali and then back to Vineet.
Sure. Vineet, you can also type your question in to the chat box if you'd like. So, Ali.
So maybe I missed this, but are ridership projections, are those more part of tier 2, the tier 2 analysis, or?
Yeah. That's a really good question. So we looked at the market in tier 1, and actual ridership projections are part of tier 2. That's an example of where when we get down to a smaller set of alternatives, we can do more detailed analysis, and ridership is a perfect example. So these are all proxies for ridership, right? We're looking at employment, we're looking at total trips, we're looking at transfer opportunities, we're looking at the work that Bus Network Redesign has done in terms of high priority corridors. We're looking at, the number of affordable housing units that are within a half a mile of the alignment itself. So those are all proxy, but we didn't do specific ridership projections for tier 1.
Yeah, CDPS will be doing ridership modeling for us for tier 2 once we've developed like service models for any of the alternatives and estimated run times, things like that. Once we provide that information to CDPS, they'll be able to model ridership.
Great. Try Vineet again.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Very quickly, I just wanted to support the great comments that Suzanne and Jay made relative to first, we really need to know how the evaluation was done. So, and Doug, you said you'll share the more detailed document, but it does kind of get abstracted too quickly without kind of really understanding the pros and cons. And 2, and I think Jay said this, is there some sense of prioritization or weighting of the different alternatives? And maybe you answered that. If you did, that's fine, but we'll have to look at that as well. But more specifically, relative to geography, the I wouldn't say elimination, but the kind of low scoring of a Gilmore Bridge connection is something that is intriguing, particularly as it makes a good connection to Kendall Square eventually. So, and given all the development that's going to happen on the Rutherford Avenue corridor section, and particularly at that intersection with Gilmore Bridge, we thought that we'd be interested to kind of do a deeper dive in that kind of discussion. And very quickly, the tier 2 analysis, once it's going on, we might realize that there was some thinking in the tier 1 analysis that might favor a revisit, or our tier 1 thinking completely like, see you later, gone, not going back there.
I feel like we're still in planning, right? And everyone that's been through project development knows that you can get into design and revisit some assumptions. So I feel like what we're trying to do is narrow down from a big long list into a smaller list and a smaller list and a smaller list. But of course, if we find something in the tier 2 that would cause us to revisit an assumption that we made or a finding that we made in tier 1, I mean, we need to have a good and solid process and have those kind of conversations.
That's great.
Yes, and to your point about it being a little too abstract, I totally understand where you're coming from, and same for Suzanne and for Jay. So we'll provide the documentation for how we did all of this. And I guess it sounds like there's a lot of interest in meeting to discuss how we actually scored these the way that we did. So I think it will make sense actually to just preemptively schedule an sort of quote unquote optional working group meeting for everyone for maybe like 2 weeks from now, where folks who are on the stakeholder working group can just attend, and that will be the one subject that we cover at that meeting.
And then the Gilmore Bridge piece.
Yes, that section, so to your question about waiting for these objectives, we didn't have a formal process for weighting any of these metrics over others. So within each goal area, there was no weighting for these. That segment, we evaluated it as Sullivan Square to Leechmere, and it scored poorly for a few different reasons. I think Teresa, you can go to that slide.
And I'd be interested to hear from Cambridge, particularly what their thinking is relative to that connection as well.
So yeah, the sections that use Sullivan and then went over that bridge, they didn't necessarily score badly in our criteria. They just didn't score as well, really, is what it came down to. as the other segments that we had identified. I should note that alignment from Sullivan Square to Leechmere, like it used Rutherford and then went over the bridge. So even though there is development planned along that corridor, it did miss, the affordable housing in Charlestown and a lot of the jobs that are present in that neighborhood. So that's part of the reason why it didn't score great on mobility and access. I know Bus Network Redesign is looking at corridors through Charlestown that go over the Gilmore Bridge, and they've identified a demand for service that makes that connection. But in the methodology that we developed for this, it didn't score very well, I think partly because of the fact that it was missing a lot of those parts of Charlestown.
Yeah.
But this is certainly something that we can discuss with you when we talk with you about the methodology for tier 1 and how we came to these findings. And as I mentioned, for the alternatives for tier 2, like we have not finalized those, of course. Those are just sort of working drafts that we have right now. So
Okay, thank you.
yeah, there's certainly a possibility for modifying those before we move forward.
Appreciate it.
Yep.
Okay. We really need to do a time check. Doug, we're at 3:10.
I think we can probably move forward unless, Jay, did we get to your other questions, or do you mind holding them until later?
I can wait till later. No worries.
Okay. Yeah, let's get into tier 2 and talk about what that process is going to look like. Because I honestly think a lot of questions that folks have will actually be answered by the second half of this presentation. So.
All right. So here's this graphic again, and we want to highlight what's coming next. So the tier 2 is engaging CTPS, as Doug mentioned, run our air ridership, our air quality analysis, up to 5 alternatives. We are this month, having a lot of one-on-one conversations around design assumptions and service planning. So that is the work that's coming up this month. So here are our metrics. We kind of went through this as well. There is a difference between the tier 1 and the tier 2 metrics. We are getting into a lot more detail in the tier 2 process. Same goals, same objectives. And then the high level assumptions, I just want to go through these really, really quickly. We are assuming a BRT level quality of service. We're looking at transit priority wherever possible. So where constraints exist, we're looking at trade-offs between general traffic and on-street parking with transit priority. Where constraints don't exist, we want to secure transit priority. We're looking at stop spacing, which is more aligned with BRT than for local bus service. And we're not limiting ourselves to the current Silver Line fleet. Turn it over to my colleague, Dan.
So as Doug mentioned, as part of the tier 2 development process, we're going to be looking at service plans for the draft alignments and just some underlying assumptions of those service plans. One of the things we recognize is that extending SL3 to Cambridge or downtown would create a very long high frequency bus route, and that precedent studies have assumed that the Silver Line extension would include multiple services. Lower Mystic Working Group assumed potential for 2 services. So we would, as we go through this process, we will look at opportunities that might include an SL3 extension and something else. In the alternatives, the draft alternatives themselves are designed to support different service options, and there'll be some iteration as we move into tier 2 about what that service plan actually looks like. And kind of the critical questions there is what is an extension of SL3? Is there a potential for a different service to serve some of the alignment? And if so, where would those transfers and connection points and starting points be? As Doug mentioned earlier, we are considering, for example, like a Glendale Square starting point for a service, and this is part of the coordination with other efforts and understanding where Silver Line fits in. And how to develop a service plan for that alignment. In terms of fleet assumptions, we'll be projecting fleet requirements for each tier 2 alternative, building travel times based on fall 2019 schedules and in schedule speeds, and then adjusting those based on observed impacts from the assumed transit priority measures in each alternative, and then working with T-service planning to make sure that our schedule designs that underlie our fleet and resource requirements are consistent with their planning. In terms of design, we've also been working with MBTA and MassDOT staff to establish a basis of design for the project that will help guide the design assumptions that feed into the tier 2 process. This shows just some basic dimensions that we've developed in coordination with those teams.
Thank you, Dan. And I'll take it from here. And I want to make one point about the first bullet you saw on the last slide about maintaining curb to curb widths. And the rest of this presentation is actually, I don't know if we'll have time to get through all of it, so maybe we'll just skip to discussion at the end. But one of the things that we're doing for all of these alternatives, or for any alternatives that we develop, is figuring out exactly what assumptions we can make about the operating conditions for that service. So we've had a bunch of conversations with different municipalities about different corridors, and we're continuing to have those conversations, and we're meeting with some of you in the next couple of weeks to continue those conversations. But for each alternative, in order to determine or estimate what the runtime will be, we have to figure out what level of transit accommodations we'd have on those segments. So I actually think let's just skip to the next slide that shows the. We were going to walk through one of these as an example. Here, you can go to the 2 slides from here. So, all right, let's just start with this as an example. And I think Thaddeus is going to speak to this. He can jump in if there's anything I miss. Essentially, for each one of these segments, we are looking at the existing conditions. We have right-of-way files for a lot of these segments. For others, we just have curb-to-curb width information, but we're trying to get as much right-of-way information as we possibly can. And for every segment, we are figuring out what we could actually fit within the existing right-of-way, and if we needed to expand the right-of-way, what the actual impacts would be to do so. So starting at the terminal of the SL3 in Chelsea, we are looking at how much space we would need along the commuter rail in order to fit an extension of the busway there. You can see sort of how that fits in here. So we're looking at how much space we need, what the right-of-way impacts would be, or impacts to any properties along that corridor. And then if you go to the next slide, then as for any routes that switch to on road, we are looking at what is available within the existing or potential future right-of-way. So on 2nd Street, for instance, in Everett, we have the existing curb to curb widths, but we know that the city of Everett is working with developers along that corridor to modify the roadway as parcels get redeveloped. So there are going to be some stretches on 2nd Street where the right-of-way will actually be wider in the future than it is now. So we want to take into consideration those future conditions and see where we can fit in transit accommodations. So we would like to assume, if you could stay on that slide for 1 second, please. We'd like to assume on the 2nd Street corridor that for the majority of the corridor, we would have the space for dedicated bus lanes from the commuter rail right-of-way up to Spring Street, where our alternative would turn off. We've had a lot of conversations with Jay about that. There may be some pinch points along the corridor, but we will, through this process, be working out what the right-of-way assumptions should be, where stop locations could be assumed to be, and where we would need new signals, where we could potentially have transit priority, things like that. So you can keep going through slides. So we continue that process here on 2nd Street, and then for right now, all of the alignments are following this path, so that's why this is serving as the example. But then when we get up to Spring Street, if you go to the next slide, the right-of-way is much more constricted. So right now, there's a travel lane in each direction on that stretch. We may have to assume that in our future condition along that stretch, we would be operating in mixed traffic. There may be the potential for assuming a different condition. For instance, if through our conversations with Jay, he thinks that it would be viable to do something else along that corridor that isn't just mixed traffic. So there are going to be some alignments. Every alignment is going to have a different type of transit accommodation depending on the conditions, but in every alignment, we are attempting to identify the most transit accommodations we think we can possibly get, either in the existing right of way or what we think the future right of way will look like. That's something that we're evaluating, all the corridors based on, and that's something that we need to do in order to get further into the tier 2 analysis to actually figure out how long it would take any of these services to traverse these corridors. But we wanted to run through that example so that you saw sort of what this process looks like, and highlight the fact that because all of these alternatives operate on so many different roadways of varying widths, the accommodations that we assume the service would have will need to vary depending on the conditions. And then, so the rest of this was just walking through one by one the different alternatives that we had drafted. The first was the Chelsea Terminal to Wellington. The second is the Chelsea Terminal to Sullivan. So we're talking to the city of Everett about Broadway and what we can assume would be out there in the future as development along that corridor proceeds, because we know that not all corridors are going to be the same in the future as they are today. But these are conversations that we need to have. Same thing for both McGrath and for Rutherford Ave. There are other processes underway that are looking at those corridors. So it's important for us to talk to those project teams about what we can assume the future conditions could look like for a service that would be operating on that corridor. But otherwise, yeah, the rest of the alternatives that we had identified were the connection from the terminal of the SL3 to Kendall Square by way of Sullivan using Washington and McGrath. And then I think the next one shows it going down Sullivan. So for this one, a really important conversation that we'll need to have with the project team for Sullivan Square and Rutherford is to understand the signal timing and signal cycles in a future Sullivan Square so that we can estimate how long it would take any bus service to get through the new intersections that would be there to get into the Sullivan Square busway. So we need to understand how long it would take to get into Sullivan Station and whether it makes sense to make that connection with an alternative or assume that an alternative is bypassing the station and just continuing down Rutherford. These are questions that we haven't addressed yet. We haven't answered these because we need to work out these details in order to understand exactly what we should or would be modeling for any of these alternatives. And then, yeah, lastly, alternative 5 was to make a connection to Kendall Square by way of Wellington. And after that, we have 10 minutes left. I think there's probably still a lot of unanswered questions that we want to get to. So we had some prompts on here, which may not be necessary at this point, because I'm sure folks still have a lot of questions that we need to answer. So let's take the last 10 minutes to open this back up to stakeholder working group members. We get feedback from folks. Vineet?
Just very quickly, in the discussion of trade-offs, in addition to parking and the need to take travel lanes, we should also talk about bike accommodations, that there may be sometimes a choice between the two, and that can create its own tensions. So it might be useful to kind of acknowledge that as an issue. I think that's one of the biggest kind of challenges that we're facing in Boston, for example.
Thank you. That's a very good point. We do have that reflected in our objectives. And for each of these corridors, we are evaluating what would be possible.
Matt Moran actually passed that comment on. So
thank you, Matt and Vineet. Appreciate it. Jay?
Yeah, so a your questions I've left. So we talked about Glendale Square a little bit, and I know you and I have talked about this a couple of times that maybe it's Silver Line, maybe it's not, but at the end of the day, it will be some sort of quality transit connection coming from Glendale Square south. But one thing Teresa said, I think I just wanted to clarify on from our perspective is that I want to make sure we're looking at really any of these corridors that I think Teresa had said, it didn't quite fit the density, criteria that maybe you would expect for a higher quality transit. I would argue maybe look at it from potential for density rather than density today. I would say look at it from what does the zoning allow? Is the city taking any action to increase the density? Are there any development trends that would indicate higher density rather than what's there today? And I mean, because we could say the same thing about Second Street and Commercial Triangle. I think we are saying that, right? That this is going to accommodate future development and allow us to build, development with less parking and better transit. So I'll just make that point and leave it there. And the last thing I was just going to mention, I was kind of curious about the Green Line Bridge conflict, and it sounded like the assumption was that there needed to be a grade separation between the Green Line spur to the maintenance facility and the inner belt bridge for the busway. Did you guys consider, I'll call it an at grade, but it would be at grade on a structure intersection there, just considering that really neither one is a high traffic corridor. Is that something that you guys looked at to overcome that challenge?
We did not look at combining those structures. It's an interesting idea. We can certainly talk to our sub consultants about it and see what they think about it. I think a lot of the issues that we had identified would still be present even if we were to do that. But obviously that's an idea that we can take back to our team and see what they think.
Thank you, that's all I have.
Thanks, Shay.
And if I could, for the tier one, we were looking at existing as well as planned land uses within the corridor.
Other folks that still have questions? Suzanne asked that given that the Yardley flyover was taken out of the Green Line extension, what would change that would make it needed in the future? I think our thought was more about evaluating whether there was a way to build the bridge that would not preclude that connection in the future, should it be pursued. But even if we decided that being at the same elevation was okay and precluding that in the future was okay, it still poses some challenges on Innerbelt Road that we'd identified. Do we have other questions from, oh, Julie asked if we can go back to the map slide, the one with the alternatives on it?
Yes.
Did you have a question that we can answer?
Oh, I just wanted to reference, I mean, it's hard to like remember since I don't have these with me. I just wanted to reference again.
Of course, I should note that we will share this presentation with folks. It's also going to be posted on the project website along with the recording of this meeting as well. But I'll just state again that we will send out the methodology memo for the tier one analysis, and I'll go ahead and schedule a meeting for stakeholder working group members to discuss that analysis in more detail. I'll try to find a time in the next couple of weeks to do that with everybody.
I have a quick question, actually.
Please.
No one else has their hand raised. I know you mentioned at the beginning that so that the map that we see here or that we'll see in the final report might look different from the, like, say, the network redesign map that's going to be released later this fall, or even just a high frequency corridor map, which is not route specific. Can you just reiterate exactly like what that process is? Or say, you know, the SL3 alternative shows, say, you know, Rutherford as a preferred alternative, but network redesign shows Main Street. How do the two plans speak together, speak to each other and arrive at a solution? Like, what is the process for that?
That is a really good question. So it is an ongoing discussion between the project teams. When we started our process, bus network redesign hadn't gotten as far along as it is now. And now it's sort of overtaken us, I would say. So we are continuing to coordinate with that team as we develop the alternatives. We're not going to develop or finalize our alternatives and advance them into the next stage of analysis without meeting with the BNERD team several times. So I can't say exactly how the processes will reconcile any differences in the next few months. We need to continue on our process and sort of see how bus network redesign continues forward, and then address any discrepancies or differences that may arise from them. But it's essentially an iterative process that's still underway.
So right now it's basically a matter of continued coordination between these two processes.
Exactly. And then so Ali sent a message in the chat that is only visible by hosts and panelists, so I just want to read it out loud for folks. I said, great point, Jay. It's a huge issue for Somerville as well, and being able to assure developers that quality transit service is coming so we can get the parking numbers down. Also getting developers to contribute to these transit projects as impact mitigation. That is something that we've heard from many of our municipal stakeholders, especially Jay and others. So we absolutely hear that and understand the need to.
Yep, same from Boston.
That makes sense. Thanks, Vinny. Yeah, we understand the position that you are in, working with developers who are trying to, accommodate a future condition or respond to the condition that you want to exist when those developments come online. We're just over time, so I'm going to go through next steps unless there's any other questions. I know some folks probably have to jump off to other calls. So for the folks who are watching the recording, I will go really quickly through next steps. We have an online feedback form live on the project website, mbta.com/slx. We're asking folks to give us input. That form is available in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. We're hoping folks can weigh in on this process, give us some feedback as we continue to refine and develop our alternatives. We have a public meeting coming up for this study at the end of September, on September 28th. And that tier 2 analysis that we've been talking about will be conducted this fall after we have refined and finalized all of our alternatives. If you have, for members of the public, you can skip this slide. For members of the public, if you have any questions about this study, you can email the project team. Teresa, if you can go to the last slide. I guess you can email me at my email if you'd like. There's also a project email address, slx@mbta.com. Either is fine. You'll receive a response about the project or answers to your questions. Thank you all very much for joining us. We really appreciate your time today for both stakeholder working group members and members of the public who joined us this afternoon. And we hope to see you at the end of September at the public meeting. Thank you all and have a great day.